Well, good evening. Have you ever wondered where all the different ethnicities in the world came from? If you've been trained in the Bible, the answer is very easy. But we live in a confusing world, a world that is confused about the subject. And so I thought what I would do tonight is just bring an apologetics type lesson and deliver some information to you that I think you might find interesting. I know that on our forms that we fill out in the doctor's office, when you go and you fill out your paperwork, there is a box for Hispanic, and there is a box for, I don't know, sometimes it says black, sometimes it says African American, I guess depending on whatever they think is less offensive at the time. And then there's Asian and then white, and it never says Anglo-Saxon, and so I write that in. Or sometimes I just check the box that says other. And you know, if you have ever taken one of those little DNA tests where you swab your mouth, Lena got one and did it, and her sisters did it too. And man, they're from all over the place. She's got, one of her sisters got African in her. So, you know, what that tells me is that we're all kind of from the same general area. Life started over there in the Middle East, and so we've kind of just spread out from there, and it makes biblical sense. But humans come in a rainbow of colors. You know, we've seen that song in VBS, yellow, red, black, and white, they're precious in His sight. The idea is not to leave anybody out, but there are different skin tones that God made. Sandy yellows, reddish tans, creamy whites, pale pinks, you name it, it's all in there. And who among us is not curious about the skin colors, hair textures, bodily structures, facial features that are associated with racial or ethnic backgrounds? We could ask some questions like, why do many Africans have deep black skin while that most all Europeans have pale white, pink, or pale pink? Why is that the difference? Why is there a difference? Why do the eyes of most white people and black people look pretty much the same, but the eyes of Orientals are slanted or thin? Why do some races have kinky hair while others have straight hair? Why do some ethnicities grow over 7 feet tall while others are less than 5 feet tall? And so there are answers to these questions, but I don't think that evolution is going to provide the answers to that. I think the Bible provides answers to that. And so what is a race? Well, the title of the lesson is my opinion, and that is, there is one race, the human race. And but the scientists, and I guess you could say even those who translated the Bible, have used the word race accommodatively. For instance, over in Zechariah 9 and verse number 6, the New King James Version mentions a mixed race shall settle in Ashdod, and I will cut off the pride of the Philistines. Well, now, if you were to look at that word mixed race in the King James Version, you can understand why the New King James Version translated a mixed race. Because bastard in that sense, not fatherless child in that sense, but in the sense of its use in Zechariah 9:6, means a mixed race or a mixed ethnicity. And so you have that. Daniel chapter 3 and verse number 4, where it says, to you it is commanded, O peoples, nations, and languages. The word for peoples is the majority of our New Testament English translations, and yet the New Living Translation uses the word races. And as well in Daniel 5:19, where it says, and because of the majesty that He gave him, all peoples, nations, and languages trembled and feared before Him. Is there a problem with that if the concept is used and has more than one definition? I don't necessarily see an accommodative sense being a real problem, but I think it does. I think ethnicity is probably a better word, because if you hold to there's one human race, then maybe race is not a great word. Ethnicity would be a better word. But a human race, in the worldly sense of the term, is defined most often as a group of people with certain features in common that distinguish them from other groups of people. Currently, there are 4 major races of humans, and they are divided up into these 4 groups: Australoids, Caucasoids, Mongoloids, and Negroids. Those are the 4 definitions that the world has used to describe the 4 major ethnic groups. Generally speaking, the Australoids, and you could probably see the word Australia in that term there, are considered a subgroup of the Caucasoids, and you can see Caucasian as the root word of Caucasoids there, or maybe the root word of Caucasian is in there, simply because the 2 groups have so many features in common, despite the fact that Australoids possess dark skin. That is the Australoid group, often known as the Aborigines. If a breakdown by percentages of the world's population were attempted, the groups would be broken up to about 55% Caucasoid, 33% Mongoloid, 8% Negroid, and 4% Australoid. That's according to science statistics. But it's interesting to note that these ethnic groups are distributed around the globe throughout over 100 nations and speak 3,000 plus languages and dialects. And I think that's even more interesting. So if we were going to speak in a broad term, research on the racial or ethnic differences has led scientists to at least 3 major conclusions. First conclusion that our scientific community has come to is that there are many more differences among people than just hair texture and skin color and facial features. Dozens of other variations have been found to exist. I want you to think about this in the sense of apocrine glands, which basically are a nice way of saying what causes body odor. That varies from ethnic group to ethnic group. Earwax is different in black and white people than it is in Asian people. Did you know that? Ours is more pasty and gummy like wax, whereas Asian earwax is more crumbly and dry. I bet you didn't know that. You wanted to know that. That's why I brought it up tonight. I mean, the gospel is for all. We're going to learn about earwax. God made earwax, different kinds. Metabolic rates are different from region to region. Have you thought about that? In the like the Eskimos' metabolic rate is 15 to 30% higher than that of Europeans. The closer you get to the equator, the less the need for a higher metabolic rate. Metabolic rates have to do with keeping you warm. And you don't need that on the equator. Our bodies adjust for where we're going to live. Isn't that cool? God must have known something about that. Secondly, we could say tonight that research has shown that in many instances, the success of a population's survival has been aided by its genetic variability. Now, the evolutionists will say that is like survival of the fittest, but if you're a creationist, you would say that's God's benevolent design. He has created us to be able to do things like that. Third, you could say despite the human species' wealth of built-in variation, and despite our constant references to race, no one has ever been able to suggest a truly reliable way to distinguish race. And so there are different ways in which people distinguish race, but we're inconsistent with that at best. Let me share with you some illustrations of that. Number one, the world will try to divide the races out by skin color. That skin color is suggested to be the criterion for the determination of an ethnic group. Yet this is also a difficult position because while most Africans from south of the Sahara and their descendants around the world have skin that is darker than most Europeans, there are millions of people in India classified by a lot of anthropologists as members of the Caucasoid race that are more dark in their skin pigment than Africans. So that really doesn't help us out a whole lot. Some Africans living in the sub-Saharan regions have skin coloration that is no darker than that of some Spaniards and Italians, Greeks, and Lebanese. So the rule is not steadfast. Number two, sometimes people have, and scientists, the ones that really want to try to label everybody, I guess, have tried to distinguish race upon stature. That stature has been suggested as a determining factor for the races. Well, there are such things as African pygmies because they're short. And they have been considered racially different from other dark-skinned Africans. For example, you think about the stature of the tall African Watusis and the Scandinavians. Very similar in stature. Yet no one says they're the same race. So it's inconsistent at best. Number three, various appearance features have also been suggested as criterion for race determination. For example, most people are familiar with the almond-shaped eye of the Oriental, or what we might call a slanted type eye. The little web of skin that is so characteristic in Oriental eyes is said to be a distinguishing feature for the Mongoloid race. Yet, if one were to accept that argument, how could it be argued that an American Indian who presently is classified as Mongoloid, yet lacks this type of eyelid, we wouldn't call him a Mongoloid? And so again, they have similar eyes, but then they don't go in the same class of people. Another inconsistency. So man is really not doing a very good job at trying to sort it all out. And the truth is that there are so many different combinations of human being as far as genetics are concerned that it's hard to separate it out. We have probably separated it out better by region than we have anything else. But it's not always the rule. There are complex issues when you try to start labeling people groups. But I guess you could ask the question, why are there so many different racial or ethnic or genetic even characteristics? What is their origin and how long did it take for them to occur? Well, biologists determine species, among other ways, by including in a species all individuals that are capable of interbreeding to produce fertile offspring. That's sort of a classification. There is only one species of man on earth, and that is Homo sapiens. That is it. That on the face of it is an interesting fact, because anthropologists and biologists place all races in existence today into a single species, and that is humanity, which points to the fact that the differences between the human ethnicities are not really all that great after all. It's also interesting to note that these differences within people groups are just as pronounced as differences among the other groups. Like Negroid people range in color from black to light yellowish brown. Mongoloid people range from yellow to white to bronze brown. And Caucasoids range from pink, like in England, to dark brown in southern India. These skin colors, I want you to listen in case you've never heard this before, because I don't know that I'm not sure if they teach it. I've been in a school so long, I don't remember if they teach it in school or not. But the difference in our skin colors has everything to do with the amount of melanin that's in the skin, that's in the body. Melanin is a chemical in your body that determines the shade of your skin color. The more melanin you have in your skin, the darker your skin will be. The less melanin in your skin, the whiter or pinker your skin will be. The more melanin that you have in your skin, the less likely you are to receive some of the harmful UV ray damage produced by the sun. That doesn't mean you can't be sunburned, but it means that you're less susceptible to the harmful UV rays than like white folks are. When my wife and I were first introduced to each other, I, from a distance, thought that she was Hispanic. Because she had a very good suntan. She was so suntanned, she was brown. And from a distance, I thought she was Hispanic. And that didn't make any difference. I still thought she was beautiful. And I still asked her out. But you know what? I did not know till I found out her name and something more about her. And it's because she has more melanin in her skin. Out of the two of us, I'm more likely to burn than she is when we go to the beach or stay outside too long or whatever. Well, I tell you all that because I'm sort of jealous of her. But I don't know how to not burn. And I'm that guy that has to cake on the sunscreen, and it looks like white frosting all over me. But I'm just saying that there are differences in that because those are the genetic combinations that God made. And we don't, if we really think about it, a lot of times the trouble that we experience in our culture, or culture clashes, is really more about culture than it is skin color. It's more about ethnicity, traditions, and ways of thinking and schools of thought than it is color. That's not the issue if we really begin to study it out. And yet we have people in this world that would like to make that the issue. That's pretty lame, if you ask me. And so, why are there so many characteristics? Well, first, the biblical record makes it abundantly clear that God created man. I think it's important to understand that man did not evolve over millions and millions of years, but rather Adam was the first man, Eve was the first woman, she was the mother of all living, and this becomes critical in determining the origin of ethnic, racial, or what you might call genetic characteristics. It's just the reasoning for it. Secondly, we must understand that we do not know that historically and biblically, we do know, rather, that the line of human descent passed from Adam and Eve and their descendants to Noah and his family. And I think that that's very important because whatever genetic material had been dispersed into the human race prior to the global flood was severely limited by the destruction of the flood. So whatever we have ethnic-wise or genetic-wise only comes from 8 people. Noah, or really his sons, Ham, Shem, and Japheth, and their wives. So 6 people, 3 couples. Because I don't think Noah and Mrs. Noah had any more children after that. So we're really basing the rest of humanity on 3 couples, if you stop and think about it. Third, after the flood occurred, the Tower of Babel in Genesis chapter 11 really separated the people out. And you'll remember that in Genesis chapter 11 and verse number 8, well, it was determined by those people, they were all of one language and one speech. And one of their big deals was that they did not want to be scattered to all the face of the earth, that they did not want to become separated, that they did not want to be scattered abroad over the face of the whole earth. And so they said, let us build ourselves a city and a tower whose top is in the heavens, and let us make a name for ourselves. They wanted to create the first metroplex area of their day and time. They wanted to build a skyscraper, and they wanted to have a big city, and they wanted to create a big name for themselves. And they didn't want to be country folk anymore. They just want to be city folk. And so God says, that's not what I want you to do. And so He divided them by language. He confused the situation, gave them languages, and then that kind of drove them out. And that is very interesting because that was appointed by God. Where those people settled became places that God ordained for them to be. If you look at Acts chapter 17. Now, I want you to think about the origin of man's colors from a DNA point of view. And as far as this goes, I want to read an excerpt from an article from Apologetics Press. And in that article, there is this chart. You'll notice that you've got the AA and the BB, and that is the darkest box on there. And then you've got 4 slightly lighter boxes, AA and big B and little b. And these represent the different genetic combinations, okay? Now, I'm going to read what he says here, and this will kind of interpret that for you. Most people, when they speak of a race, refer to the racial characteristic of skin coloration. For the purpose of the present discussion, I will limit my discussion, for the most part, to the origin of such a characteristic, the writer of this. The AP staff is not listed who the author of this was. In humans, production of the skin coloring agent melanin is controlled by 2 pairs of genes. We can designate them as capital A, little a, and capital B, little b. You might see that up there on the chart. The capital letters represent dominant genes and the small letters the recessive genes. Capital A and capital B being dominant produce melanin very well, being recessive, and little a and little b produce melanin to a lesser degree. Gary Parker, in his book, Creation, The Facts of Life, 1980, has observed that if Adam and Eve were both capital A, capital B, that one in the upper left-hand corner there, they could have produced only children with the darkest coloration possible. That would not have been their genetic combination. And they themselves likewise would have been dark. That, barring genetic mutations, would have produced a world composed of only dark-skinned people. But as has been noted already, the Negroid race composes less than 10% of the world's population, so by a process of elimination, this choice can be ruled out. If Adam and Eve both had been little a, little b, the one right down here in the lower right-hand corner, they could have only had children that were AABB, little a, little b. So that being the lightest coloration possible, genetically speaking, they would have just only produced light-skinned people. The real question is this: is there a mechanism by which the racial characteristics which we see today could have originated with one human couple? In short, few thousand years or so of history of the earth. The answer is a resounding yes. If Adam and Eve had been heterozygous, that is, a capital A, capital B, little b, what you've got there in the second column on in the middle there, 2 dominant, 2 recessive genes, they would have been middle brown in color. And from them, in one generation, racial differences could have occurred quite easily. Figure 1 expresses the genetic possibilities that could be a result if Adam and Eve had been heterozygous. Note that in a single generation, one could expect, theoretically, these colorations to be produced. 1 darkest, 4 dark, 6 medium, 4 light, and 1 lightest. A person born capital A, capital B, carries genes for the darkest coloration possible, and since all genes are dominant and has no genes for lightness, if that person married another person who likewise carried all dominant genes and moved to an area where no intermarriage with people of different colors occurred, the offspring resulting from this marriage would then carry the same dominant genes. These offspring will have lost the ability to be white. Conversely, if a person who is little b, and thus the lightest possible, marries another person who likewise carries all recessive genes and moves into an area where no intermarriage with people of other colors occurs, henceforth this union will produce offspring only of the lightest coloration possible. The offspring so produced will have lost the ability to be black. Then no longer have genes necessary to produce enough melanin for the black color. Thus, starting with any 2 parents who were heterozygous, middle brown in color, extreme racial colors, black and white, to name only 2 examples, could be produced in such a way that races would have permanently different colors. Of course, it is also possible to produce a middle brown race that will have a fixed middle brown color. If the original middle brown parents produce offspring, either the capital A, little b, or a, capital B, and these offspring marry only others their own color, avoiding intermarriage with those not of their own genetic makeup, their descendants will be a fixed middle brown color. Now, we get back to something very interesting. The idea that all of our genetic combinations came from just a few people, and they look just like this, right? That's what Noah and his family looked like, correct? No, that's just an artist rendition. Although, if you look at Facebook, people look like that more and more all the time. They've got their little cartoon characters up. It is likely that people of various colorations intermarried. And a lot of people ask about that. Moses had a different colored wife. You remember that Miriam had a problem with his black wife. Did you ever read that in the Bible? She's very dark-skinned. Song of Solomon mentions a woman that's very dark in skin color and how some of the women didn't like her. But you know, the preponderance of so many colorations in the world is evidence that they did. Even the evolutionists agree on this point. It is likely that Adam and Eve were heterozygotes. That is, they had within them every possible genetic combination. They could have had all kinds of looking kids. Every genetic possibility was possible with them. And that is very interesting. I want you to think about the fact that racial characteristics existed before the flood. But Noah's 3 sons and their wives were the only survivors to pass their genes to the post-flood population. That is, after the flood. The inherent variability with these survivors, along with the possibility of other mutations, would have ensured diversity. And that's what you have. And God has expressed His interest in the human race, all of the human race. In Genesis chapter 12 and verse number 3, God says to Abraham, I will bless them that bless thee and curse him that curseth thee, and in thee, in you, shall all the families of the earth be blessed. He doesn't say nations, he says families. Isn't that interesting? For the Bible tells us in Matthew 28:18 through 20 and Mark 16, go into all nations, go into all the world and preach the gospel to every creature. Every creature, all nations, the gospel is for all. And God cares because God created everybody. But I think about the dispersion of the people there at the Tower of Babel. It had a significant effect on the subsequent development of the history of mankind, where people gravitated to different parts of the world, probably based on the confusion of their language. They would meet and procreate, and they would establish their nation, and they would establish their language, and they would procreate with those people. And so the genetic combinations were being filtered out to the different areas of world based on language. Think about that possibility. We know that the Lord has made of one blood, Acts 17:26. One blood, all nations of men for to dwell on all the face of the earth, and have determined the appointed, the times before appointed in the bounds of their habitation. These verses tell us that yes, there have been different nations. Yes, there are different ethnicities. Yes, there have been people who have had unlawful sexual relationships and created a race of people or an ethnicity. group of people that maybe shouldn't have been created. What do I mean by that? That sounds awfully judgmental. Well, let's think about this for just a moment. Lot's daughters got their dad drunk. And from that came two nations of people, Moab and Ammon. And they became a thorn in the flesh to all of Israel. You think, man, maybe they could have consulted God about that first, but then there's a group of people that now exist that then existed that maybe shouldn't have existed, but they came into existence. But you know, what good came from it? Well, Ruth good came from it. You know, we would not have the story of Ruth in our Bible had Lot and his daughters not had that incestuous affair. You think about that for a moment. Can God bring something good out of something bad? Sure. What about Abraham and Sarah? And Sarah's grandioso idea to take Hagar and raise seed up for them that way. Now you got Ishmael and the Ishmaelites. The Ishmaelites posed a problem for the Jews for a long time. And it's kind of funny because that's the tribe of people that came along and had bought Joseph up and sold him to the Egyptians. Isn't that interesting? His relatives, his cousins. So there are groups of people that have come of wicked relationships. And of course you could say the same thing of the Samaritans. The Samaritans came into existence because the Jewish people intermarried with non-spiritual people. And yet there were some good people that came along in spite of all of that. So there is that sense of the term in which I speak. And yet, at the end of the day, we're all from Adam and Eve, aren't we? We all came from him, Shem, or Japheth. And that's the case. We have a world that is so divided and wants to teach racial division. And I believe that it is up to us as New Testament Christians to set forth the biblical record. Because the Bible says, blessed are the peacemakers. And you can take that both ways. You want to take it both ways? You can help them to become at peace with God by helping them to become at peace with one another. You know what's cool? When I travel to India, I try not to talk about it too much, but it's the only nation I've ever been to outside of the U.S. And I have brethren over there. And I have people that we're close to, that we're tight with. We speak a different language. We look totally different. And yet, you know what we have in common? We have Adam and Eve as our common ancestor. And we have Jesus Christ as our common Savior. And I would say that His blood is thicker than Adam's blood. And so, old Marshall Keeble used to say, he'd get calling somebody brother, and somebody would say, now, Brother Keeble, that's not our brother. He's not a Christian. He says, well, if I don't meet him in Christ, I meet him in Adam. And that's true. We need to preach the truth on that issue. And maybe, just maybe, as we talked about some of this stuff tonight, and I don't expect you to remember all the capital A, little b, I don't even remember all that stuff. And you know what? It makes for a nice article to share with somebody. But you have to get people to think in terms of, if they believe the Bible, there's no other way, there's no other position that they can hold than to admit that we've all come from the same Creator. That we've all come from Adam and Eve, and more recently from Noah's one of three sons. And who knows how that line must have crossed between them and us. Somebody has said, are you related? Or there's been times where I've met other people and I say, well, are you kin? You know, are the Vaughts, is every Vaught in Titus County kin to one another? I don't think they claim each other all the time. I know not every Patterson claims each other. That's my wife's people. And I said, are you kin to them? They said, well, no, not really. That's a different bunch. I said, well, I guess somewhere between you all and Noah, y'all are kin somehow. And somehow between us and Noah, you and I are all kin too. But our kinship that we have that's closer than that is in Christ. So I'll end the lesson there with the invitation to come to Him, who unites all people into His body by His blood. If you've come here tonight and you've never obeyed the gospel, we want to invite you to study that out with us. We want you to come forward and ask for that Bible study. We'd love to study the Bible with you. We want you to know how much our God loves you and how He demonstrated His love for you in the giving of Jesus Christ to die for the sins of every person in the whole wide world, in every nation, in every language. If you are here tonight and you are a Christian and you simply need the prayers of the church, you're welcome to make your way down forward while we stand and while we sing.